please give them a call and set up a meeting and tell them that you stopped and that you'd like to share with you. And if you come from Judah's lab, he'll listen. And Stan is a very nice guy. Listen, he's not an easy, he's a very, he has his agenda, and the agenda is what guides him. But he's a good guy. Because coming from Judah's life, we brought home, it's a survival mechanism. Yeah.
If you can find the seat, we're going to get started in about 2 minutes.
Please, because here's not an endpoint, it's a platform to begin to reconstruct. Of course, that's right. Also, I find McGill is an initial period. It's in the initial period when people are looking at themselves. And so expansion can be still puts forward. The cardiology of McGill is a little bit more. And that's why the Institute is really a good place. It's growing. And you can see the stand. I don't know if it's going to do anything, but I think that would be a shame to spend it. You're doing great stuff. You're really just the cognitive system. You're really well. So, what's the question?
Okay. Everybody ready? Are you comfortable? We have some nice refreshments in the back. Coffee and tea. Please come take a seat. Grab a seat. There's wine. So we have a very special evening tonight that's planned. We're very excited. Before I introduce tonight's host, I'd like to, so there's throughout, obviously there'll be a lot of questions I'm sure from you throughout the evening. There are also papers in front of you, and those papers can be used, if you want, you can write anonymous questions. Some people don't feel comfortable saying some questions, they can be personal. You can write those anonymous questions, you can pass them up to the front, or you can just kind of, I don't know how we'll do it, but you can maybe give it, maybe you can give it to Joseph. However you feel most comfortable, if you like that anonymous, we can do that as well. Otherwise, there will be a question and answer period at the end. So, a couple of months ago, I approached my neighbor, Julie, and I had heard that I didn't know very much about it. We saw each other in Montrealer. I didn't know so much about it, and I said, I really think it's really important that we start talking about Jewish genetics and what it means for the future of the Jewish people, what it has meant for the past. I know that my wife and I, we both did genetic testing before we got married. In the religious community, it's very well known, it's very well accepted today. But I think in the broader community, it's not as accepted. And it's not as known. So I thought it would be great to come here tonight and just to have some kind of an information session to talk about it. And so Julie agreed to it and arranged this whole amazing evening. So thank you very much for arranging this great evening. And so I'm going to introduce Julie, and she will introduce everyone else and host tonight's evening. So without further introduction, Julie Kristof.
Thank you. I understand that there's a lot of fellow NDG folk who are here, so that's really fun. I just live up the street on Kingston, and indeed that's how we've met. And in the park on Shabbos afternoons also, I think I've come to study with you a few times. I really appreciate everybody coming out and hearing about genetic testing, about we feel that it's really important that awareness is built in community, and that people know how to get tested and to get tested. So I am the mother of a child who's affected by a disease that is specific to our community called Familial Dysautonomia. And I realized quickly after she was born, and when I have an older son who's, I'll tell you a little bit more about them in a minute, but I realized that there was very little awareness in community about testing, aside from Tay Sachs, which is something that ended, Tay Sachs testing that ended quite a long time ago. So I decided to get involved in raising awareness and doing evenings like this. And I'm very, very lucky because I invited and they agreed to come to have Dr. Tay Sachs with us, who's right there, who is a geneticist and can answer any questions about genetics or anything else medical. He's a fellow at the MUHC. And Dr. Karen Buzaglo, who is an old friend whose son and my daughter are the same age, and also an expert in fertility sciences. Fair enough? Sure. Okay, without getting too much into the bio. So, what we're going to talk about tonight, and I just want to say, like, I'm very casual, like I'm up here, I feel very far away, but whenever any of us are speaking, if you have a question that you feel needs to be asked, just raise your hand and we can be a little bit more conversational. If there's something, I heard that you speak in French more, no? Yeah. I know if you don't understand something, we can just raise your hand and we can repeat it in French as well. But most of the presentation is in English, but our French is good enough that we can go. So what we're going to talk about tonight is I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story and about how this came to be, a little bit of history. And then Dr. Saskin is going to talk a little bit about genetic testing and get into a bit of the science. I will then talk about what are the available ways of getting tested and things to consider. And then Karen is going to cover off what happens if you do find out that both of you are carriers. What are some of the options? All right, and then I guarantee that Rabbi Berneth will have some excellent words of wisdom to close things off. So thank you all for coming. And maybe I'll put down my wine. What do you think? It's a good prop, though. It actually keeps me doing something. So a little bit about me. There's a lot of clicking, so I apologize. So this is me pregnant with my second child, my first son. My son Alex is now 14, and he was typically developing. And my pregnancy was completely normal. I had been tested for Tay Sachs when I was 15 in high school, like many of us who grew up in Montreal. But no one told me during any of my pregnancies that things had evolved and conditions that had not been testable when I was 15 were now testable. So the science had evolved a tremendous amount. I was 37 at that point, right? So I got tested when I was 15, and I was pregnant with Miriam when I was 37, had her when I was 38. So a lot had happened in that time. And I tell you this because a lot of people say, well, why don't we test people in high school? And I don't tend to recommend that because things change so rapidly that I think it's better for people to get tested closer to when they're planning on having kids, generally. So Miriam was born. She was almost immediately put into the NICU, the intensive care unit, because she wasn't swallowing properly. She was certainly not doing what normal babies do, but we didn't have a diagnosis until she was 18 months old. And we discovered that she has familial dysautonomia. So familial meaning passes down through the family, it's hereditary, and dys meaning an autonomia, so the autonomic nervous system, which I'm not going to get into in any great detail, doesn't function properly. But if you think of anything that we do automatically, any of like swallowing properly or regulating heart rate, temperature regulation, any of that is all under the auspices of the autonomic nervous system. So now she's 11, And as you can possibly as you imagine, when we discovered at 18 months that she had this fatal chronic debilitating disease, it was like having a carpet pulled out from under us, as you can imagine. And our lives are her life is very complex, and our lives as a result are very complex, but she's a pretty great little nugget of love and energy. But we are seen and followed and have the help from many different organizations, from the CLSC, from the Mackay Center, she goes to the Mackay Center School, through the NYU and follows us, McGill, Chai Lifeline. Like she goes to Camp Simcha, for those of you who know Chai Lifeline. It's an amazing camp. But she's literally followed by a dozen specialists on a routine basis, and then there's other critical times. So it's had not only an impact on her, but of course on our whole family, right? Because I can't, it's almost impossible for me to work full time. My husband was going through medical school and residency and fellowship while all of this was happening. So it was not an easy journey for sure. But here we are. She has amazing days, as you can see. Not every day is amazing, but it's pretty cool. So how do we define, what are we looking at today? So we define this where certain genetic conditions and mutations are more frequent in either Ashkenazi, and by Ashkenazi I mean Central Eastern European, Sephardic, or even Mizrahi populations. We have a lot of Iraqi Jews here in Montreal, and those would be one example of Mizrahi populations compared to the general population. So that means that these diseases either only happen in these populations or happen at a much higher frequency than in other populations. And Abby will talk about that a little bit more momentarily. So how did that happen, right? So just for some our history, at least from an Ashkenazi perspective, is that, as we might remember, in the late 18th century, all the Jews of Eastern Europe were moved into one particular area and really isolated, right, into these shtetls where there were pogroms, of course, but as the population grew, so did these mutations became more and more frequent in the population. And then, as the population was exploding, families started emigrating, started leaving Eastern Europe to go to a lot of different places, including North America, Western Europe, North Africa, and Australia, quite a few, and then also to South Africa. We have a South African Jewish community. But all that to say, I have a lot of Sephardic friends who will say to me, well, it's not really that important because, I'm probably not that affected. But if you ask a Sephardic person if they have a grandparent who's Ashkenazi or some Ashkenazi or Eastern European lineage, they might remember somebody in their lineage who came from Eastern Europe to Morocco or to anywhere else. So, and as we all know, there's a whole generation of Jews who were lost during the Holocaust and different, and also during the Spanish Inquisition. So there's our genetic history is very spotty. So there's a lot of genetic history that was lost over time. So as people emigrated and started kept marrying each other, these mutations became much more frequent in our population. And just to be clear, I put a star next to recessive because there are other kinds of mutations that recessive means that if you're a carrier, it doesn't affect you, right? So I'm a carrier of familial dysautonomia, but it has no impact on my health, whereas there are other kinds of mutations, for example, the BRCA, which is a BRCA, which is a mutation that increases people's likelihood of getting certain cancers, ovarian breast cancer, that is also frequent in the Jewish population. But that's something, if you're a carrier of, it affects you. So these don't necessarily affect somebody in the recessive mutations. So it's important to make that distinction. I'm going to invite Abby up to talk about some of the geekiness of genetics.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just
Do you
to
want to go back up to that other
sure,
slide?
sure.
Just to show about the founder effect? You can explain
Sure,
founder
there we go.
effect.
So first of all, hi everybody. I'm Abby. I love question answers. So if anybody has any questions, just pop in. I do like to get like geeky a bit. So if I'm going overboard, you could also just stop me. Okay.
But
So-
you like that, right?
so-
yeah.
So the idea is that if these mutations that we're talking about, the first original mutation that happened, you have to think about it as random chance. These things happen. Anytime you pass down your genetic information to somebody else, before you pass it down, you have to copy it. You copy it and you give it to somebody else. Anytime you copy it, you can make a spelling mistake. The DNA code is billions of bases long, billions of letters. So even if it makes one mistake in those billions of letters, that could be an issue, okay? When you have somebody, so what we're looking at here, just this representation is people with different colors. It's really a nice representation. So let's just say for instance, sorry? Oh, perfect. Okay, so let's just say this person who's brown right here, or red, I'm not sure. This person who's brown right here, let's say, by random chance, had a mutation in one of these genes. And I'll go through what genes are and I'll go through all that. When they moved into a population that was isolated, like the Jewish community was isolated, every time they had a child, they were able to pass down that mutation they had. So because only a few members of the Jewish community came and established a larger community, whatever they brought with them was spread into that larger community. Okay? We'll touch back upon it. I just want to go a little bit into what DNA is, what recessive is, and that'll give us a little bit more of an idea. Okay, so I just wanted to start here, and I'll come back. So, you know, you saw those pretty pictures of the DNA all twisted around, but what is it? What are you looking at when you see that twist? Okay? And what you're actually looking at is this. Okay, this is a representation of what DNA is. If you look in the DNA link, there's individual bases in the DNA, and each could be represented by a different letter. And that's the alphabet. That's the code that's written in the DNA. So when you see this picture here, sorry, just want to show you. So when you see this picture here of this fancy strand of DNA like we've all seen before, each of these individual knobs is a base, so it's a letter. Each letter is different, and this is very long molecule. Okay, so how long is it? If you look down at your hand and you try to look at the smallest possible cell, everybody look at their hand for a second, the back of their hand. Hopefully, if your skin's dry, you'll be able to see this a little bit more clearly, okay? If you could, okay, and you have your reading glasses on. If you look very, very carefully, you can see tiny, tiny little, squares, little things. Those are little cells, okay? Inside of each of our cells, we have our DNA code. Now, how long is it if you were to stretch this out the strand? First of all, it's thinner than a human hair. But even though that it's thinner than a human hair, it stretches over 2 meters long, okay? And in each of these tiny little cells, we've got 2 meters of DNA wound up inside of those cells. So it's very intricate, it's very long, it's very complex. Now, another important thing to remember is that for each part of the DNA, like how do we divide it? What do you do? How do you read the DNA? Well, the example I like to use is a cookbook. Okay, so let's say you wanted to make a chicken recipe. Would you read your entire cookbook? No, you flip to the page with the chicken recipe. And the DNA works in the same way. The DNA is divided into tiny little recipes that we call genes. Okay, so a gene is just a recipe. So, for instance, there is a gene that lets you produce dark pigment. I have a change in that gene that doesn't allow me to produce the dark pigment. So I produce a pigment that's a little bit lighter than other people. So we all are individual, we all have these little changes that make us unique. Okay? So now, the other caveat that makes it not like a recipe book is the body's smart. The body knows that all these different genes are important. So what does the body do? The body has 2 copies of every gene. You've got your copy and you've got a backup copy. So if one of your copies doesn't work, That's fine. You have your backup copy ready to go. And in that way, when Julie's talking about she's a carrier for this genetic disorder, she has one copy that doesn't work, but one of her copies works just fine. And when one of her copies work just fine, she'll be healthy. She won't have any issues. The problem happens is if her, with one copy that doesn't work, meets somebody else that also has one copy that doesn't work.
Do you want to go to the next slide?
Perfect. That's even better. Okay, so
Better than your hands.
better than my hands, but I think my hands work well.
That was,
You know?
that's good.
So let's say the blue copy is the white copy is the copy that doesn't work. Okay? Because you have one copy that works, it's fine. Your body can compensate, you'll be okay. But every time you have a child, you give one of those two copies. And if it's by chance every time, 50-50, and it's a 50-50 chance for every single individual piece of DNA. The DNA doesn't get given in one shot. Every piece gets given kind of individually. It's an easier way to think about it. So if by chance Julie passes on the gene that doesn't work, and her husband passes on the gene that doesn't work, and then the kid has no functional copy, that's when you could run into problems. So that's what we call a recessive disease, a recessive illness.
Excuse me.
We'll start here and then we'll move over here.
I think I just missed it. I was like in my head for a second. Like, why do you have two? There's only two copies?
No problem. The reason why you have two copies, it's not the reason why you have two copies is because in order to be a healthy, functioning human being, you need each gene to work. You need each individual recipe. Okay? But you don't need two copies of every recipe. You really just need one copy of every recipe. The body, as a backup, has two copies. So if there's a problem with one of those copies, it's fine. You've got a functioning copy on the other side. The problem is if by chance you inherit two non-functioning copies. If you have one copy, you'll never know that the other copy doesn't work because you're perfectly healthy. Okay?
Is there like an undo button, like where you like?
So no, that's a very interesting question, and of course that's what the people are working on now. Okay, so in terms of when were we able to actually read that code that I showed you? The first time we were able to read that code was in the year 2000. Okay, that was the first time we were able to read somebody's genetic code. About 3 or 4 years ago, there was an interesting discovery of something called CRISPR-Cas9. I don't know if you guys have heard about it. It's in the news sometimes, and it's a tool that bacteria use to edit the DNA. And right now, it's coming into the lab, and we're trying our best to find ways to use it to change DNA. You don't want to go too fast because we want to make sure everything is safe. If we change a wrong base in a wrong gene, for instance, let's say I think I'm changing the gene for red hair to give me black hair. Let's say I think that. But it by accident changes the BRCA gene. And now I'm at risk for various types of cancer. So we're very slow at that stuff. The technology's coming, and one day we'll make it there. But right now, it's not there. You also heard recently that there was a doctor in China who produced 2 babies that are resistant to HIV using this CRISPR-Cas9 technology. He's actually been disbarred. He's been kicked out of his university, and the Chinese government is suppressing all information about him because they're embarrassed that he did that as well. Because it's not the right time, and the scientific community is moving, but it's a slow push. Okay. Any other questions? No? Okay. So,
Do you want to go up to the first slide? Yeah. So.
okay, so why do carrier screening? So like I said, if you have one copy of a gene that doesn't work, you'll never know it because your other copy is functioning properly. Because the other copy is functioning properly, you have no idea. The only way to know is to be tested, is to do genetic testing. What does genetic testing entail? What is that? So what genetic testing entails is we were to take a sample of blood, we send it to the lab, we take the DNA, your DNA, out of the blood, and then we'll look at specific regions to see if you have changes there, to see if you have mutations there. That's what we do. That's what we do in genetic testing. Yes, sir?
How do you decide which regions to look at?
And we're going to get to that. Okay, so we'll come back to that here. So, right now we don't offer universal screening for everything. Our technology isn't there yet. I can't, every baby that's born, I don't analyze their entire genome. I don't think that's right ethically, and we could talk about why I don't think that's right ethically, but at the same time, we just don't have the technology for it. What we can do is we could do testing for parts of the DNA that we know specific populations have are more frequently mutated, okay? So in the Jewish population, you can see this is for Ashkenazi Jews, so you can see the frequency of carriers. So for Tay Sachs disease, it's 1 in 30. So almost one of us in this room probably carries a variant for Tay Sachs disease. Chabad disease, familial dysautonomia, 1 in 32. Right? So these are the different diseases in the Jewish population that are more prevalent, that has a higher carrier frequency. Now, what do I mean by a high carrier frequency, this 1 in 30? What I would like to say is when you're having a founder mutation, we all have the exact same mutation. We don't all have different mutations for familial dysautonomia, we all inherit the same mutation. So if I were to take your blood and test the DNA, I'll look for that exact mutation in the blood, okay? The DNA code is really complicated, and I always give the same example. So if anybody's ever seen me in the hospital or seen me in clinic, they've probably heard this already. But what I always use is the last name Smith as my example. So let's say I were to read out the last name Smith, and it were to spell S-M-I-T-H. That's perfect. That's the proper spelling for Smith. There's no error there. If I were to spell out the last name Smith and I spelled S-M-X-T-H, that's a bad change. It does not spell Smith anymore. We could all agree on that. But if I were to spell out Smith and it's spelled S-M-Y-T-H, in that case, I'm left with kind of here. You know, it still spells the last name Smith, but it's not the exact correct spelling as before. Now, the last name Smith is 5 letters long. The DNA code is 3 billion base pairs long. So, in the same way as it's hard to tell for some of these changes, it's very difficult for me to say whether or not they're actually important, whether or not they could go on to carry disease. So what do? I want to test you for those letters that I know. Those letters that are responsible for 98% of Tay Sachs disease in the Ashkenazi Jewish population. So I'll only look for those specific mutations. Okay? Is that clear? Do you have any other questions about that? Yeah.
Just with the slide, I'm curious because of the diverse Jewish presence that started from Catherine the Great and spread out the Ashkenazi. Do the prevalence rates change in the Sephardic population, even though it's an Ashkenazi origin, as you're showing us for the Ashkenazi?
So this is specifically for the Ashkenazi population. Okay? So let's say you're Sephardic and you have one grandparent. Let's just say you have one grandparent that's Ashkenazi Jewish. In that case, you have, let's say 25%, you have 4 grandparents. If one of them is Ashkenazi Jewish, then you have 25% of your ancestry is Ashkenazi Jewish. Okay? So you would have to multiply that 25% by this number in order to get your risk. Okay?
So,
but it's still elevated above the general population.
So it does differ.
And
is
what
the
is
answer.
it for the
Yeah.
Sephardic? If in general, just in the general Sephardic survey, what is the prevalence rate for these diseases?
Yeah.
Well,
Given
less,
the
less
fact
than in
that
the
there's
Ashkenazi, for sure.
mixed cultures and
Yeah, so it's difficult to say because we have to track down the ancestry of every person that we're testing exactly.
fair enough.
If you're purely Sephardic and you have no ancestry that's ever come from Europe, you have other problems to worry about. Okay?
It's true.
That's the thing. Okay? One of them, for instance, is thalassemia. Okay, so beta thalassemia, there's a prevalence in North Africa. So I would recommend that you be tested for thalassemia. It all depends on what your ancestry is. Okay? Does anybody else have any questions about that? No? Okay.
But she has it.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Inflammatory breast disease, isn't that for cancer, breast cancer, isn't that one of them?
Inflammatory breast disease?
breast cancer.
So breast cancer is certain, not all cancer is due to hereditary genetic problems. What we think is that all of cancer is caused by genetic problems, but it's caused by isolated genetic problems. So let's talk about BRCA, for instance. Okay? You need, for BRCA to work, you only need one functional copy. If you have one functional copy of the gene BRCA, it's protecting you from breast cancer. Now, if you're born in all of your body with one copy of BRCA knocked out, you don't have a backup copy. So if anything were to happen in an individual cell by chance that knocks out this other copy, that cell doesn't have BRCA anymore, and that cell can start dividing and cause cancer. Okay? In the general population, if you had two functioning copies of BRCA, and in one of your cells in your breast it gets knocked out, well, you have another functional copy. Now, we know that breast cancer happens in the general population. So we know that there are times that lightning strikes twice in the same spot, and you lose your two copies of these genes, and you can get cancer. But if you have a predisposition that you would get if you inherited a BRCA mutation, you only have one functional copy. So you don't have the same backup.
That's what I want to know, thank you.
No problem.
And part of of this slide that we wanted to indicate is the SOGC is the Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and in 2006 they came out with recommendations to governments as to how many and which of the diseases should be tested. So this is some of the rationale, right? So in Montreal, in the public system, we can get tested for free almost immediately for Tay Sachs, and Familial Dysautonomia. Why? Because the carrier rate is quite high. The accuracy of the testing is also very high. And and it happens in much greater frequency than other populations. So from a governmental perspective, it's important to understand that there's also a certain economic argument to say, well, we're going to test the people who are most at risk for the most, the ones that are happening the most often. But we added the other ones because actually in Ontario, the others are tested regularly and routinely through the public system.
Yeah.
And our group is very active in advocating through our Ministry of Health to make that happen as well. It just hasn't happened yet. But we're hoping that indeed will happen. So we've put in, so that's part of this slide is also to indicate why governments are actually covering the cost of testing for some, but not others, right?
Yeah. And then like I said also with the last name Smith, how we're looking for those individual letter changes that we know very well. Even if, for instance, you look at something like Gaucher disease, it's 1 in 15. You're saying, oh my God, it's 1 in 15. Why don't we test for Gaucher's disease? The reason why we don't test for Gaucher's disease is because the Ashkenazi Jewish mutations only account for around 90% of all the mutations in the Ashkenazi Jewish population. While for Tay Sachs disease, it's over 98%. So we'd only be testing you for 90% of the risk. So is that worth it? Of course I think it's worth it to be tested for these things. But from a government standpoint, you have to measure up the cost benefit of doing these tests. It's unfortunate, but it's what we do in a public system. Go back here.
I kind of referred to that.
Okay, so that's fine. So who should get tested, okay? Now, anybody with at least one grandparent of Ashkenazi Jewish descent should be tested, should do carrier screening. And that's our only requisition at the MUHC, at the Glen site. As long as you have one grandparent, you don't have to prove it, you just need to tell us that you have one grandparent that is Ashkenazi Jewish heritage, and that's enough for us to offer you testing.
Sorry. The testing consists of the list that you previously discussed.
So
or does it extend beyond?
So it's much less, in fact. Okay? So right now at the MUHC, we only do testing for the top 3 diseases right here. Okay, these top 3 diseases. The rest of them, we put in applications to the government. We're trying our best to get them to move forward. But every time the government changes from liberal to CAC to going around, it's pretty much us starting over from scratch again. So right now it's in the works, it's on the ministry's desk, but until they give us the okay, we can't start testing for it.
Even though the prevalence rate for cystic fibrosis on the bottom of the Ashkenazi Jews is even higher than familial dysautonomia.
Exactly. But it's important to look at this in the greater perspective, because the carrier frequency for cystic fibrosis in, let's say, the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean region in French Canadians is much higher than 1 in 25. So I don't know if it would be fair while we're not offering it to the French Canadian population.
But they do, no? They have it, no?
So if you're from Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, that's something that we offer them. Okay? It's much higher than 1 in 25 in Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, and we offer it for them.
And last question.
Yeah, no problem. Keep coming. I love questions.
Is the restriction financial, or is it just that it overwhelms the system? You can't possibly do it. Well, there's financial, but there's also you don't have enough people to do it, enough machines to do it.
I mean, that all factors into financial, but like I said, like for Gaucher's disease, it's 1 in 15, but the Ashkenazi Jewish mutations only count for around 90% if we were to test you. So at that point, we're testing you, we're saying, okay, well, we're 90% sure you're not a carrier. Is that enough? You know, is that a test that's even worth doing? So that's a question that we have to ask ourselves every time we do a test. Will our test pick up all the disease? Is it prevalent enough to warrant screening everybody for it? Is the test acceptable? Does it hurt? Does it cause undue stress? There's a lot of different things we have to ask ourselves before implementing these tests. Do I think that our panel of 3 diseases should be expanded? Of course I do. But it's important that for each disease that we expand our panel to, that we have a reason, we understand exactly, there's clear guidelines that have been written in the medical literature of when to do universal screening and for what. So true, it is a money thing, but at the same time, there's more to it than just finances.
And
what's that?
And just if I can clarify that in the top 3, one of the reasons that was also chosen is because in combination, from what I understand or recall, 1 in 10 of us is a carrier of one of those, right? So that, I mean, you look at the 1 in 30, but really if you're looking at the top 3, and then if you combine the rest of them, the statistic goes to 1 in 8. So it doesn't diminish hugely, but you know, if you expound, those 3 actually cover a lot of the population.
You said the blood test. How much blood do you take from a person for that?
So what we take for the blood test is 2 tubes of 5 milliliters. So 5 milliliters is like if you took a dropper in the kitchen, like that would just do drops, and you did like, let's say 20 drops or something like that. A human has many, many liters of blood, and we want to take like, you know, 5 or 6 milliliters. So it's not that much. We like to take 2 tubes with 5 milliliters each, just in case something goes wrong with the first tube. Then we have another one back up. We don't have to bring you back to extract some more blood.
Ah, okay. Well, that's perfect. Just wanted to know how it works.
Of course, of course. And it's not me. I work in the lab now, so I would receive the blood, but it would be our lovely nurses, and we have blood takers that all they do is take blood. And so, you know, they're very good at what they do.
Talking science, is there others, let's say Eastern Europe, similar sets of diseases?
So every single population has their own set of diseases. Especially the more isolated the population, the higher the prevalence of disease. So one of the highest prevalences of heritable disease in Europe, let's say, is in the Finnish population. People from Finland. It's such an isolated small population that never had people moving in and out, that they're very high prevalence of heritable diseases. What about here? When we look at our Inuit communities, they have 5 or 6 heritable diseases that are important enough for us to consider testing. So every little community, every individual community, the more isolated, the higher the rate, but every community has their own.
But these are not like imported diseases, like someone didn't like just give a disease, it's just mutations, is that it?
So it's mutations, but there could be a little bit more to it. So let's talk about cystic fibrosis for a second, because I find that very interesting. What is cystic fibrosis? So cystic fibrosis, I don't know if anybody has ever come into contact with somebody with cystic fibrosis, but the main problem that they have is that they can't get their mucus out of their lungs. So their lungs will just fill with mucus until they can't breathe, they get infections, and they live a shortened lifespan. With more medications that we're developing daily, they're living longer and longer, but it's still not a pleasant thing to have. So like these diseases, you get cystic fibrosis when both of your genes that code for a salt transporter isn't working. And you need salt in your mucus in order for it to be a little bit looser. If there's no salt in it, there won't be any water in it, and you won't be able to cough it up. Now, what happens if you have one copy that's not working? Well, if you have one copy that's not working, you can secrete half the amount of salt, and what does that do? That actually protects you from cholera. So in any population where there is a high prevalence of cholera, there's a high prevalence of cystic fibrosis mutations. So all of Europeans, any community, individual community that had cholera in it, cystic fibrosis is way up. What about something like sickle cell disease? Sickle cell disease is something that's very, very prevalent in sub-Saharan Africans. Why? What is it? Well, when you have two mutations in your gene that makes the red blood cell, the red blood cell doesn't function properly. And it could turn into, normally it's a round donut, it could turn into like a sickle shape. Like that would be on like the Russian flag, like the star and the sickle. So because the sickle shape isn't as flexible as the donut shape, it gets stuck in places. And you could have terrible pain crises, and you could have bad infections, and that's what sickle cell disease is. Now, what happens if you only have one of those changes? Well, if you have only one of those changes, that if two causes sickle cell disease, only one of the changes protects you from malaria. So any place that has endemic malaria infestation has a high rate of sickle cell disease. What else protects you from malaria? Thalassemia. Thalassemia has a little protective effect against malaria. So anywhere where it's like a warm climate, around the Mediterranean, with high mosquitoes, there could be also thalassemia. It's more for sickle cell, but a lot of these diseases have an underlying advantage to having one copy that doesn't work.
For that one, for somebody that gets malaria, would somebody having a problem with platelets, like bleeding, or just a sort of platelet problem, would that cause it?
Cause
Catching
malaria?
No, not cause it. That person could catch it easier.
No, the platelets are nothing to do with malaria. Malaria has to do with the red blood cells, not the platelets.
Okay, that's what I'm to know.
Let's get back on that.
Okay, let's get back on track here. Okay, any more questions? No, okay. Let's keep moving. So who should get tested? We said anybody who has one Ashkenazi Jewish grandparent. Okay? So if it's an interfaith couple, okay, or there's one person Sephardic and one person's Ashkenazi Jewish, we recommend testing for the person who is Ashkenazi Jewish. Okay? And if we find that they carry any of these mutations that we're talking about, then we'll sit down and we'll discuss how to test their partner. Okay? Their partner will not have one of the Jewish mutations in these genes, but they could have any other mutation just by random chance. So at that time, we'll sit down and we'll discuss with the couple exactly what to do and exactly where to go from there. But even if one person of the couple has one grandparent that's Ashkenazi Jewish origin, we recommend to go for carrier testing.
And if I may add, there's people who have discovered that they actually have Jewish ancestry because they've gone through this process. So there's stories where a Jewish woman married a Roman Catholic man, and she was tested positive for something, and they sat down to chat with him, and he said, no, my family is completely non-Jewish, no ancestry. And when they went through the testing, he was actually a carrier of the same mutation, and discovered that in fact he had ancestry that somehow came from that area of Eastern Europe.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I've never heard that before.
Yeah,
But, I mean,
it's in Tablet magazine.
It makes
It's on my
sense.
website.
It makes sense though. Okay, who else? So individuals that are considering donor eggs or sperm for a pregnancy, where one person or the donor, or there's any question of the donor being Ashkenazi Jewish. Okay. Or if you just want to give more information to your children. So if you have children and you want to, spare them testing, if all the grandparents can be tested and nobody has those mutations, guess what? Neither do the kids. So it could be good to give on to other members of the family. Okay, and then, like we talked about, these other populations can have other diseases that need to be screened for. So, if you're Sephardic or Mizrahi, it's important to talk about the thalassemia, like we talked about.
Yeah, I think I'm up.
Okay, you're up.
I'm up again. Does anybody have any questions for Abby for now?
Yeah, one question. Dora Sherm supposedly claims to, you know what Dora Sherm is,
Yes.
right? They claim to test for 8 categories.
More, actually. Yeah, many more, yeah.
But are those 3 top that you mentioned in the 8?
Yes.
And if so, are the 8 on your list?
Yes.
Or is it others?
Doria Shorim covers all of the ones that were on that list.
So basically they cover more than the
Correct.
MUSH
Yeah.
will cover.
Let me talk about that,
Okay.
okay? Because that's part, thank you, Abby. Good job. Okay, we'll clap again after it. I learned a lot, actually, thank you. All right, so let me talk about this, okay, in a second. I'll talk about Doria Shorim first because that's something that you brought up. But Doria Shorim is an organization out of New York that really operates for communities that are Haredi and are based on shidduchim, or fixing up, right? So the way it works is when you're in yeshiva, in high school, or in seminary as a girl, you get tested. They come to Montreal, actually, they're in the Orthodox community. They charge X amount, 200 I think, for the panel. But as an individual, you're given a number, right? So I go get tested and I'm told you're number 891. And then when it comes a few years later, it's just for whoever to fix you up, they'll say, okay, 891, we want to fix you up with number 2011. You call Doria Shorim, you can correct me if I'm wrong. You call Doria Shorim and you say, we want to fix up this person with that person. Are they genetically a good match? If it comes back and they say, right, then they just never meet. These 2 individuals don't meet, right? But they will never know their results unless they go do their own testing, which happens also when 2 people meet and there's a love match. I mean, these things happen, but even if they call Doria Shorim and beg, they're never going to get their results. They have to go through their own process. So there's advantages and disadvantages to that. But it's really limited to the ultra-Orthodox community. So if you're somebody, you mentioned that you were tested through Doria Shorim?
Yeah, they have a clinic on the park or something.
So what did you, I'm just curious, because did you have to like sign something that you weren't in a relationship, or?
Yeah, they don't accept engaged couples or married couples.
Right.
And they don't tell you like what you have.
Right.
But it's $350 US.
Okay, so I'll correct my slide. I'm sorry. All right. So it's really for that purpose. So in the broader community, most of us don't meet through shidduchim, right? We tend to meet and date and decide who we're going to marry, and have to be proactive in our own testing so that we know our own results. Right? So that's Doria Shorim. You've been through Doria Shorim, and so have you. Is there any questions about how that works, or? Okay, good. So then we have the public system, which we were just talking about, which in Quebec covers 3 conditions: Tay Sachs, Canavan, and Familial Dysautonomia. There's no cost, and in fact, right now there is no wait time because a number of years ago the department developed an online modular program where you can go through and get the information you need, answer some questions so that they can validate that you actually read what you should be reading, and you automatically go for a blood test, and you get your results fairly quickly, right? So if you're somebody who's comfortable with reading these things online and going through kind of some genetic counseling online, then there's no wait time, and because this exists, the wait time actually to see an individual genetic counselor has also reduced down from 6 months to, I don't even know, like it's not very long now.
It all depends on why you're seeing genetic.
Correct, right? And to, what Abby was talking about also is if you have any concerns, one of the things that is really necessary is to find out more about your own family history if you can. So for example, I only found out once my daughter was diagnosed and we told our families, because of course we want to tell our families there's genetic history and people should know that we're carriers, they might be carriers. It was only then that I found out that my mother had a younger brother who died as an infant. I never knew that. Now, is it because of familial dysautonomia? Maybe, maybe not, but the fact is that there was an infant who died, and the same thing happened on my husband's side, right? There was also a sibling who died very, very, very young of something unknown, because familial dysautonomia could not be identified at the time, but there was something wonky, right, about our genetics. So it's very important to ask your parents, ask your grandparents, like, is there any kind of history of wonkiness that nobody really knew about, because then you could call a genetic counselor and say there's something wonky, right? So it's really important to kind of ask those questions in advance and be responsible for your own genetics, right? The reliability is huge, obviously, yeah.
So if each, let's say, grandparent had several siblings and none of them had anything, and then you go down and they each had several siblings and none of them had anything, essentially is that worth getting tested at that point?
So yeah, so because Abby was explaining this and this,
Yeah.
right? So because there's a 25% chance that it can go through generations without anybody being affected, right? So I'm a carrier, and if we go back up to that, you know, there's a chance every pregnancy that I have a kid a 25% chance that I have a kid who's affected, but there's also this 75%, right? So there might be a whole lineage of carriers or non-carriers, but you don't know until you have, like, till lightning strikes. That was your word, right? Like, it's really crappy luck, right? That 25% happen in both of our bodies. You came in a little bit late, but I have a son who's typically developing, who's not sick, so we don't know if he's a carrier at all, but he might not be a carrier, or he might be, but he's not affected, and I have a daughter who is affected. So she was the one who was hit with lightning. Okay? So I think it's still worth it. Would you agree?
I would say it's 100% still worth it. A lot of times with the family history, you don't hear about these things. So, you know, her mom might not have even known that there was a previous sibling who died younger than, you know?
There's a lot more stigma around it, right? Yeah.
I had a grandmother who lost about 5 females. She had 8 children of only 3 Chabad. So one died of disease, one died of nothing, but there was babies that died. So on my mother's side.
So you would call the hospital and say there's something weird,
That's
right?
what I want. That's when you're telling me that I should be concerned about it, because most of my sides of my family come from Eastern European, Ashkenazi background. So I would want to look into that, I guess. So what I would do is just get tested, and that's it. You could tell me if there's something.
So, I mean, it's not as straightforward as that often.
Okay, that's what I wanna know.
Unfortunately, nothing in genetics is very straightforward.
No, I need to know.
But what I will say is that
I'm asking.
with the blood test, we can rule out that you're a carrier for these 3 conditions. But if you want a more in-depth analysis of your family history, then all you need to do is be referred to the MUHC by your family doctor to see a genetic counselor. And it may not be tomorrow, but there's no rush. So when you have the time, so I don't know if it's in 3 months, I don't know if it'll be in 6 months, but what you'll do is you'll sit down with the genetic counselor and you'll draw out a family tree together. That's the first thing you'll do. And you'll go through the family tree all together, and we'll see who died, what did you know about, how do you know about, and then afterwards there may be a little bit of investigating to go on. Okay, well, I need you to call your mother and ask her about this. Is there anybody else in the family that I'm...
It's a little tricky. My family came out of the Holocaust and the Second World War, so
Right.
it's a bit tricky.
That's what I said, right? You lose a
That's what I'm saying. There was a
whole
whole thing that
whole
was
generation.
I have family members that
Yeah.
that were gone for only in Poland and another one. So there's not many more people around to ask. My grandmother passed away.
Yeah.
So my mother
So you
doesn't
do-
remember much. She was
Yeah.
a child during that time. She was
So you
born
have to
then.
do the investigation
Yeah.
happens to the extent
You'd be
that it
surprised
can.
how much we can get from
Yeah.
just sitting down with you and talking about it.
Yeah, where you came from, what parts of Poland or Hungary or,
Well, no,
right, whatever,
no.
I'm making up.
No,
right?
I know, but I'm saying it's
Yeah.
out there, you know, that's
Exactly.
what I needed, I wanna find out because my mother mentioned
Yeah,
her mother had many children and
Right.
so many, few of them died at childbirth.
Correct.
And
So I think-
so they're not sure what.
just getting back on track, so I think that's the process, right? You would say to your family doctor, there's something, there's something weird, can you have a referral to the MUHC genetics department, and they would guide you through the process, okay? Then there's a whole variety of private companies that serve the Montreal, that are in Montreal and around Montreal, that will test from 15 to doing almost like a whole genetic map, and they'll still look at very specific things. There's a cost involved that is significant. It's not inexpensive, but I say to couples who are getting married who ask me about the cost, I said, think about what you're spending on your band, on your DJ, on your dress, on your, and in the context of that, I've had some bubbies, I've had some grandmothers say, that's what I'm getting for my grandchild for their wedding, right? I'm gonna get them tested. Hold on a second. And then in that case, there's no wait time, and the counseling is extensive, and the labs are great. So I have, in front of each of you, there's a little postcard with I have a website on there, and all of the companies that offer these tests are listed, and each of them has, you have to look at the different variables, which we'll talk about in a second. Sorry, you had a question.
Yeah, so did you say they do a full genetic map of you, or just?
There's some, I can't speak to their methodology completely, but some of the private companies, they won't give you a complete genetic map, but they do process more than just 15 or 20 or check for 30 different.
Do you get the data, or
You get the data.
So you can use it in the future for other?
For sure, and Abby will say, your information is your information, right? And that's a really important, I'll repeat that again, because your genetic information, and Abby and I had a long conversation about that, your genetic information is your own, and you should, we feel like you should really keep it as your own. Sorry, go ahead.
I'd like to ask Abby
Yeah.
what the reliability of the different labs, the different groups of genetic testing, is there an identical reliability, or is there a variability that one should be aware of?
And so it all depends on which company we're talking about and which test. You have to look at it specifically for the test. So let's talk about ones that people know about. Everybody's heard about 23andMe. I have no idea what they do.
Unreliable.
Well, let's talk about this, not necessarily
No, that's
true.
not necessarily
That's not
true.
necessarily true.
It's not necessarily true, but I really have no idea what they do.
Right.
They don't release that information. I don't know what they're testing for. I don't know how it's done.
Let's talk about 23andMe separately, because I think it's a different issue. But in terms of the private companies that we list, right, on the website, right, in terms of Medicis or Dyna, I can't remember. But yeah, those ones have very reliable laboratories, which is why they're recommended. Even through the MUHC will refer patients to them if they want to get expanded screening. But some of their methodologies differ. Right, so some of them will use, and you can get into it more, like some use a spit test, which uses more enzyme testing, but in terms of the results that you're getting, they will be very clear about the reliability of the tests, right? So I wanted to separate 23andMe out a little bit, because it's a little bit more problematic. Does that answer your question about those?
Yeah, it certainly, you
Yeah.
screen the ones that you're recommending, and
Right,
no, and that's an appropriate answer, thank you.
okay, no problem. Alex?
Are these private companies private in the sense of private information, and do you protect your information?
Yes,
Because
as I understand it.
there's some companies like I think 23andMe was purchased by Pfizer, I think,
Correct.
recently. So like,
Yeah.
what happens to this information?
So so that is a direct to consumer company, right? And they're very clear that when you pay your $99 US, that they can use the information that they gather for other purposes. So that's why it's so inexpensive. These companies, one of the reasons it's more expensive than the $99 US is because they're not using your information for any other purposes except to report back to you, to put your information in a database that will hopefully not ever be breached, right? But I guess that's a risk we take with any days anyway, right? But they're not using the information for anything other, and that's why the cost is so high, because it really does cost a certain amount to do these kinds of tests and to offer those services, right? There was another question. Yeah.
Okay, just to clarify, so for the first three typical ones that are done at the MUHC, so is it on a walk-in basis, or you make an appointment? How does that work? No?
So the way it works, I'll just say one more time, we created an online module. Before anybody does genetic testing, it's very important that you understand exactly what's being tested, what are the implications of the test. There's no genetic, we will never force anybody to do a genetic test. These are voluntary tests.
Yes.
So it's important that you know everything before you consent to the test.
Okay.
So in order for us to ensure that you know everything, you have two options. The one option is to come in and see us, sit down with one of my counselors, and they'll have an appointment with you, but there's a wait time for that. So to get around that, because there's so many Ashkenazi Jewish couples that want testing, what we've done is we've created online learning modules. And what that is let's say it's like 10 slides. You go through the slides, and afterwards we'll ask you 1 or 2 questions just to make sure that you read the slides.
Okay.
After that's done, you will get a call from, when I was doing my genetic counseling rotations in genetics, I was calling couples all the time. I call them, I tell them, okay, you passed the module, I get their email address, I send them a copy of the blood test requisition. Once they have the copy of the blood test requisition in their hands, they can go to the MUHC or any of the hospitals within the MUHC, the Glen, the General, the Jewish, and they can get the test done, okay, at that test center. They'll take the blood, they'll send it to us, we'll do the analysis, and then we'll call you with the results, okay? If it's normal, I'll call you and say, listen, we didn't find anything, everything is normal, go on with your life. If we were to find something, at that point, I will invite you in to come sit down with me, where we can sit down and take as much time as we need to explain the results and explain what's going on. So we've really streamlined the process with these online modules to make it easy and accessible to everybody.
The link, by the way, is on this website. So there's so testjgd.com has a section called How to Get Tested, and the first line is a link to that module and like the prerequisites for it and any other information.
My last question is just, let's say you were potentially tested in high school but don't remember, because they went around sometimes and they tested high school.
Yeah, we were talking about the Tay Sachs testing.
Yes.
Yeah, it ended in 1995, and even if you were tested in high school, one of the things that I was saying, I think before you got here, is that I was also tested for Tay Sachs, but it was 20 years prior to having a kid. And now, as you can see, you can get tested for so many more. So even if you were tested for Tay Sachs, just go again and either do the public for sure. I think it's a no-brainer, right, for anybody who has one Ashkenazi grandparent. And then if you want to look into the private companies, I'll talk to that in 2 seconds. Yeah.
Okay, great. What do you want to do it when you're single or before you have a partner? Just saying, wouldn't that make more sense?
So, yeah.
I don't know. No? Yeah? Okay.
Well, I don't think there's a perfect time to do it, because
if you have that option,
yeah,
I'm assuming that would be like the more logical option.
I think it depends if like in a Dor Yeshorim context, you're not going to date somebody because of the results of your test.
Got it.
That would make sense. But I think in general, I would hope that the results of your genetics won't necessarily preclude a romantic partner, right? And as Karen will talk about in 3 minutes, probably, she's going to talk to you about some of the options that are available to us with incredible science now for 2 people who might be carriers of the same mutation to have their own biological children if that's what they choose. For if you're both carriers of the same mutation, it's not the end of the line. And Karen will give us a very optimistic perspective of that momentarily. Is there any other, in terms of when you're looking at the different testing options, right? There's a conversation between testing individuals and screening populations, which is more philosophical. I'm not going to get into that right now. But there's also some ethical questions that are important to think about, right? So, what are you willing to do? And I think you were talking about this 90% issue, right? when we were looking at the grid, and you get a result that says, well, there's a 90% chance that both of you are carriers of the same thing, then how do you make your decision on go forward, right? So, you know, or if you're 99%, do you have issues with terminating a pregnancy? Do you know, there's a lot of different ethical issues around these tests to think about, and rabbis and other clergy and other advisors and doctors are incredible people to talk to about some of those issues, right? A lot of it depends on your own values and beliefs. Whether you go private or public, right? These are different things to consider, and which private. Why isn't it moving forward? And when you're looking at private testing, what a colleague of mine gave me this list of things to consider. So if you're calling the different private companies, what should you be asking about, right? You should be asking about the certification of their lab. You should be asking about what kind of medical geneticists are involved. Are they physicians? Are they counselors? Who's there? What kind of information am I going to get? What kind of analysis is happening? So these are questions, and some people will say, and the confidentiality of data, obviously, but other people are like, well, I want to go to a private company that's in my neighborhood, right? Like there's other convenience factors that you might want to consider as well. And then I want to talk about direct-to-consumer for a second, like this 23andMe. And the best thing about the public and these private companies is that they're required to at least make sure that you understand what the implications of your results might be, right? So this pre-counseling is really critical to really understand if you get a positive result, what does that mean, and what are your options? A direct-to-consumer like 23andMe does not offer that option. Their laboratory, I mean, Dr. Rosenblatt called and said their lab seems to be okay, but I think the biggest danger is the confidentiality of your results, and that's something to think about. Your DNA is your DNA, and you know, I think you said, like, had Hitler known about this DNA testing, like, it's a very extreme thing, but you know, you don't necessarily always want to be identified as a carrier in a certain way. Until very recently, Canadian law allowed insurance companies the results of your genetic testing results in order to see if they would grant you health or disability insurance. That's until last year, right? And now there's new laws in place that are being contested in Quebec, but that's a whole other issue that basically says none of your business what my genetic, you know, if I have a predisposition for heart disease when I turn 84, right? So those, your genetic material, your DNA, is really important to just keep to yourself, right? So the direct-to-consumer, like I said before, they're inexpensive because they're using your data. Did you have something to add to that? Okay. Did you have a question? I don't know who that's. What?
Oh, yes.
Elliot, do you have a question?
I do, but it's first of all, I have a few things. I think there is an area that we haven't even talked about in terms of confidentiality. That when we're doing all this, if we look at Huawei, for example, and access from other governments that can store information and use it at their discretion in, hold on everyone, this is reduction ad absurdum, in a eugenic, dystopic future. I think we've unbelievably come to a point where there is a possibility to even consider that. Even storage of blood samples, depending on whether you have a biopsy, whether you have a certain kind of serum tests and whatnot, it's stored at the hospital, and if you're on a protocol or something, that could be stored for life, and there could be access.
And so you donate blood, and that's in storage. And
so the question is a little bit odd because you're presenting incredible data. I thank your daughter for directing you to this and to share with us this wonderful, really important messages. But there is concern to how do we, for all of us, how do we protect ourselves from a dystopic, eugenic, horrible thing that should never happen, etc. but we see we're inching in microscopic ways toward that. So that's my question is, when we go to multiple labs, how long do they store it for? What is the protection that we have? Because of the fear for, we have the rise of anti-Semitism and whatnot, and we can all imagine.
Yeah. So
But
those, I think those are
essentially
great questions. I don't have
I don't
answers
think
from the
there's an
private
answer to
companies.
that.
And I think, when I talk about ethical issues, these are very, I mean, we could talk philosophically. I want Karen to come up though very soon, but, Avi was talking about how some of these mutations also have an adaptation that's positive, that my daughter might not only be beneficial to my bringing information, but there might be some kind of a benefit. I can't see it, but there is some benefit from an evolutionary perspective right? So I think your question is a really good one, and eugenics is certainly something that we've moved away from. But I think if we're testing for specific items, if we're going in, I think there's a very big difference between saying, okay, we're going to test for familial dysautonomia, Canavan, Tay Sachs, Gouchers, or a list of 10, let's say, versus saying let's look at a whole, let's read a whole, genetic script. I think they're two very different. Would you agree?
Yeah. So you can get anything you want in the private world. You can get somebody to read your entire DNA code for you and send it back. The difference is that if it's in the private world, I have no idea what they do behind their closed doors. I know in the public system here at the MUHC, when we get the blood, we'll do the test and we hold on to that blood for 3 months to make sure that the test went well and that you don't have any other requests from us. After that, we discard the blood and we do not test for anything that we don't ask you for. So if that's your major concern, is your data, eugenics, things like that, I would recommend that you probably go through the NUHC rather than a private company.
It's not a concern, but if I
It should be a concern. It's a genuine concern.
Yeah.
Of course, but it's a general one. If I may give you an opposite about holding it on.
I'm going to move on in
for 3
like 30
months,
seconds, if that's okay, away from the
is-
philosophical.
Can you enter into genetic modification to correct the dysfunction? We're far away from it, but we're entering into that sphere by holding on to the samples, and perhaps in Julie's daughter's lifetime, do have effective genetic modification that we can introduce to reverse.
Well, we certainly need the samples to do the experiments on,
You
but that's
would
not
repeat-
something we
you
would
repeat
do.
the sample.
But that's not something we do at the NUHC, so I'm directly in the lab right now. Every door is under lock and key. All our servers are completely protected, and we dispose of all your samples, and we do not keep any extra information on you that we do not need. So if your major concern is this, I would definitely recommend going through the NUHC that we know is a secure site.
But that is also a tricky question. Let's say you do cure it, you're removing something that's probably positive. You mentioned it's like,
So in terms of curing it, that's not like tomorrow. That's something that's very far away, and that's not something that we're worried about now. That our technology now allows us to detect it in advance. And when we do detect it in advance, there's things that we can do. And I'll let you guys take it from there
Great
exactly
segue.
what we do.
That's a good segue. Okay, we're going to turn it over to
Thank
Dr.
you.
Karen Guzak.
Hi. Nice to see everybody. Just to give you a little bit of background, because I think it's fitting that I grew up, in a sense, at the MUHC. I trained there as a medical student OBGYN, and turns out that I'm working now in a private setting in fertility. And just to get back to this public-private scenario, just to disclose, I have no, how do I say, there's no compensation for me from any of the genetic testing or the IVF that I'm going to talk to you about. This is all coming from just giving you scientific information about what can be done if there are two people that are having a baby together and that are both carriers of a genetic mutation. Okay, so I'm going to give you the scientific data.
So like had my husband and I known that we were both carriers of the same thing, what could we have done?
And also the fact that 20 years ago when I was in medical school, we couldn't do these things. so much, so fast, that we're in a situation in 2019 where there are solutions to these problems. And that's what I'm going to share with you now. So what are the options if we're both carriers? One that I'm going to go into detail is in vitro fertilization with pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. What this means generally is that we will stimulate a woman's ovaries to produce a lot of eggs, as many as we can from a given menstrual cycle, and we will retrieve those eggs and fertilize in the lab in vitro with her partner's sperm and create embryos. And those embryos are left to develop for 5 to 6 days and then are each then biopsied. We take a few cells from each of those embryos and send them off to a genetics lab to tell us whether or not those embryos are affected by this certain mutation. I'm going to go more into detail about that in just a second. Other options is obviously adoption. If you know that you're both carriers of a mutation, you can always adopt a child. You can also decide to use a donor sperm if it is the male that has a genetic defect, or donor eggs if it's the female. If a woman is pregnant with an affected fetus, she can decide to terminate the pregnancy. And or she can also accept the risks of this pregnancy and of having an affected child and prepare for the outcome. So to go into a little bit more detail about what we do in IVF. So just to give you an explanation of IVF in Quebec is it's no longer covered by Medicare. From 2010 to 2015, the Quebec government was covering for in vitro fertilization. In November 2015, they stopped covering because the costs were too high for our government. The same week, Ontario started covering for IVF. And now there's talk with La CAQ to restart an IVF program where one cycle of IVF would be funded, and this will probably happen in 2020. So hopefully in a year from now, we'll have coverage again. The cost of IVF is pretty much the same, whether you're doing it at the MUHC or at Saint Justine or in a private fertility clinic. People have to pay out of pocket for these services, and the cost is about $6,000 to $8,000 for a cycle of IVF, plus the expense of genetic testing of the embryos, which could range from $2,500 to $5,000. So there is a huge cost associated with this, and I'm hoping that part of it will be covered when hopefully the government starts covering IVF again. The genetics part wouldn't be covered, the genetic testing of the embryos wouldn't be covered, but the IVF would. So just to go back to how it works is basically we'll see a couple in the office, and they'll already come in knowing they have, they're both carriers of a genetic mutation, or they're coming and they want to get tested. We offer testing, we offer panels that vary from 100 to 600 mutations that they pay out of pocket for. The cost is, I believe, $750 per person. So each would get tested and find out they're both carriers of mutation, or they'll come in already with that information and saying that, or they'll come in also with an affected child and say, well, we have an affected child, we want to make sure that our next child or our future children won't have the same mutation or the same disease. So they will, the next step after that is for the partners to both get tested. They get a blood test sent to a genetics lab, and and they have counseling obviously before the testing even happens. And the mutation is found, and as long as the genetics lab can find the mutation and create a probe, and you'll be maybe able to tell us better how that works, they can create a probe that will lead to finding the mutation in the embryo. And once that process is done, then the couple will undergo in vitro fertilization to make those embryos. So at the beginning of a woman's cycle, this is an example of an ovary with little follicles. Each follicle contains an egg, and the both ovaries get stimulated to have all of these follicles become mature. This is an example of 3D image of an ovary with larger follicles. So these are mature follicles. When we see that there's enough mature follicles coming from that ovary, we will trigger the ovulation. And then 2 days later, we'll do an egg collection. I'll show you a video of that if it's going to work. It's working. Is it? Oh, I'm just going to go back. If I click on...
That's why my file was so big.
It's the video. Oh wait, no, all right, it's not working. But basically, we use an ultrasound probe in the vagina. We have a little needle at the tip of the probe. We freeze it around the cervix. We give a medication through the IV to help the woman relax. And as a 10-minute procedure, we collect or we aspirate all of the follicular fluid. That fluid gets sent to the lab. The lab embryologist will tell us how many eggs we've retrieved. And then that same day, the partner will give a sperm sample, and the eggs will be fertilized by injection of 1 sperm per egg, and we will be creating embryos in the lab. So the embryos are left to develop for 5-6 days. On the 5th or 6th day, the embryologist will take a sample without harming the embryo of a few cells, and those cells will be sent to genetics, and all the embryos will be frozen for a future embryo transfer into the woman's uterus. A couple of weeks later, we get the results of the genetic testing, and the test will tell us out of the embryos which ones are normal embryos and which ones are affected. And so then obviously we will know which embryos we can transfer without having the risk of transferring the affected embryo. Any questions so far about the process? Yeah.
Is it painful for the egg?
The egg retrieval?
Yeah.
So a woman might feel some pelvic pressure while we're doing it,
Okay.
but the idea is that she doesn't feel pain. So there's
Right.
medication given so that she doesn't feel pain.
Okay, and she has to go through a couple of weeks of medication
Yes,
before.
so it's about 10 to 12 days of stimulation with hormonal injection medication.
Okay, 10 to 12.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, are there only 25% of the embryos rejected and 75% successful?
That's a very good question. I don't know if I have the answer to that. Maybe Avi can give us some statistics.
So it's random chance.
Yeah.
So let's say every time.
I got it, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
But theoretically, 25%, right? Theoretically,
Yeah,
but it's
it
random.
doesn't, but it's, I was.
So each of those eggs and each egg and each sperm has a 25%
Yeah, 1 in 4 chance.
1 in 4 chance of carrying the mutation and the embryo together. When the egg and the sperm are put together to create an embryo, there is a 1 in 4 chance that that embryo will be
That's why
affected.
I don't.
50% that will have
It'll be a carrier.
a carrier, and 25% will be normal.
And the eggs can be stored for what length period?
The eggs can be and the embryos can be stored indefinitely.
Indefinitely? Okay.
Yeah. So out of that IVF, and the genetic testing will have hopefully multiple embryos to choose from for a first child and hopefully future children. Most often though, we would have to repeat IVF cycles depending on a woman's age mostly.
Okay.
Depending on her ovarian reserve. The younger she is, the more embryos we can get.
Right.
The older she is, the less eggs, the less embryos we're able to get, and sometimes we have to do multiple cycles of IVF to get enough embryos to make it worthwhile to test.
Exactly.
Some people will test 1 embryo at a time. I could say for a fact in the US, it's completely different than in Canada. In the US, people are testing or doing, preconceptional carrier screening at large using private centers. Here we're limited at the MUHC to 3, in Ontario to 10, I believe, and hopefully we're going to get more on that panel in Quebec. But in the US, they're testing for everything, let's say, and just being very, maybe exaggerating, but they are testing for everything, and then the embryos are tested not only for pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, but just general pre-implantation genetic screening where a couple that has no, not necessarily previous miscarriage or previous affected child or any mutation for that matter, just a healthy couple coming in to do just general IVF for infertility purposes, will test their embryos or will screen their embryos to make sure that the karyotype of the embryo is normal, that they're not transferring an embryo with Down syndrome, etc.
Okay.
So it's a very different world in the U.S.
Okay,
than,
right.
than over here.
And the egg donors, are we allowed to compensate them, or it has to be a donation? How's the
So the egg donor.
Yeah.
So egg
How's the
donor.
legality
So
of
in
that?
Canada, we are not allowed. It is illegal to pay for
Okay.
an egg donor.
Okay.
What couples will do if they were to use an egg donor is they will purchase eggs through an egg bank in the U.S. or abroad, and have the eggs shipped to the clinic,
Okay,
and
that's
then
legal.
fertilize with their partner's sperm, create an embryo, and do the rest.
Okay.
But that
Some
or
changes coming, right?
I don't know that it's going to change.
Okay.
I think it's going to be.
There's been some talk about it.
There has
Right,
been talk,
okay.
actually with Anthony
Anthony,
Housefather from Côte Saint Luc, at the House of Commons, but I don't believe that there will be compensation for donor eggs in Canada. There is also, couples that will come and have an altruistic donor come and do a cycle for them.
Okay.
But we don't know what happens behind closed
Okay,
doors,
exactly. You're not
right?
supposed to, exactly.
Like, they're not
But you can't have
supposed to be
no
paying.
legal. Okay.
That's right.
You can give a donation, but you're not supposed to have like a
That's
contract.
right. No
Okay.
compensation.
You can buy them sofas or whatever, but you're not supposed
That's
to.
right.
Okay.
No, but we
Okay.
don't know that.
Exactly. Okay.
Yeah, that does happen.
Right.
Any other questions about the process? I have Melissa here with me from our clinic, from ProCare Clinics. If you have any questions about genetic testing on the private side. And other important issues, yes, definitely. Here we are. Know your family history of miscarriages, early deaths, and possible genetic diseases before your first visit to your reproductive health professional. This we've alluded to earlier. And take the time to speak to document your family medical history with the fertility specialist as well. And be aware, yes, of course, and this is the traditional way of finding things. Be aware that routine tests such as ultrasound in pregnancy may pick up abnormalities in fetal development, mostly at 12 weeks and at 20 weeks when we do a full anatomy scan of the fetus. And be prepared for this and discuss implications and your personal belief system with your healthcare professional before you do such tests. And that goes back to, knowing what you're getting yourself into before you do a certain test, whether it's genetic testing or ultrasound for that matter, or any kind of test. You should be well counseled prior to doing it.
And I think that's it. Yeah. So those are, it's a lot of information. So I put cards out with the testgd.com. That's on the website is this second link, which is the link to the counseling through the MUHC, but that's on the website, so you don't have to write it down. If you go to testgd.com, all the information is there. We've been very careful. We were just talking about public and private. There's a lot of private companies that are listed. Again, we get no compensation the same way, and we have no preference. I think in those cases, everyone has to make up their own minds about what's appropriate for them in their own personal belief system, and have the conversations about confidentiality or process or how many and those kinds of things with genetic counselors from each of the companies, just to get that information, because they offer really good services.
Rabbinical wisdom.
Yeah.
Oh, go one more slide, because you have to see a cute. This was Purim last year, so yeah. So that could be in the background. That was Purim.
Okay.
A year ago.
Thank you, Dr. Bazaglo. Just before we go on to questions, I just wanted to talk just a little bit about some of the halachic ramifications of all these things. I definitely did not specialize in this. It is a specialty all on its own in rabbinics. There are rabbis here in Montreal and all over the world who do specialize in this, and they are consulted. And I have thank God, with various couples that have come to me to try to help facilitate various elements. I have consulted with those rabbis, and I'm happy to do that for anyone and to refer them. So as far as obviously genetic testing in halacha, it's very much not only encouraged, as we spoke about Dor Yesharim, how the religious community, I believe, and the halachic community has been on the forefront of this genetic testing, and that's really amazing. Unfortunately, and I say it unfortunately for the broader community because I definitely deal primarily with the broader community and not as much with the Orthodox religious community. So I think that it's much harder for the broader community, and I wish there was as good of a system. If, I was thinking to myself, well, what happens if just two people just like say they're single and even though they're in a relationship and just do it and see if it works, and because it just seemed from Julie, from your description, like that Dor Yesharim is so much further ahead on a lot of the Ashkenazi, especially the Ashkenazi genetic testing than the others, which I didn't know until tonight, which is really amazing, and also at the same time, like it's bittersweet. Like it's sweet for some, but bitter for others, and I wish there was a way to answer that. Now that's on the genetic testing side. I think that halachically there's no issues with that. There's no problem halachically with giving blood, and especially if you can prevent, and would encourage that to be done while the person's single. I do want to talk a bit about Dr. Bazakwa, and I am going to refer to you and ask you if maybe you know specifically within your private clinic various things. So I did a bit of research over the years. I have dealt with 6 or 7 in vitro cases in my rabbinate, and so it's very, very complicated. Obviously, we want as much as possible halachically for couples to figure out a way. Naturally, it's not always possible, and in the Jewish, in halacha and in the Talmud especially, there is so much focus, and almost, I know we joke about Jewish guilt, but there's a lot of guilt focus on having children, and so because there's so much focus on it, there needs to be some way, and thank God with all the medical advances that have happened, and just being here tonight and listening to what you've all said, it's just unbelievable to see that we really, in this world, there's so many possibilities, and even if you're both carriers, and even if, there's always opportunities. So I will just bring up a number of things that you should think about. And again, I'm generalizing. I don't know. Every specific case must be consulted. If you are one that would consult a rabbi and halacha, and that's important to you, then they must be consulted. IVF is generally permitted, but the case has to be if the couple is married, which means the IVF should be directly from that couple. That would be the best situation. It's not always possible. So if ideally the entire fertilization process must be strictly supervised by a trained third party, we call a shomeret. Have you ever dealt with shomeret? You have? Okay, so in their clinic.
At the Bailey, right? Isn't the Rebbitzin a shomeret?
I don't know if she is, but we work with Montrealer,
Okay.
organization that provides these women supervisors, I'm going to call them,
Right.
that come and accompany the couples through the process of insemination and IVF, and are there every step of the way to make sure that the husband's sperm is actually going to make that embryo.
So let me just kind of piece it all apart. So I'm going to talk about Bonei Olam. Bonei Olam is an amazing organization, an organization that I also have had the privilege of working with. They're private. They really, it was done by a few very good-willed people in the community who had various situations, and obviously that's, as in Julie, as your situation, that is some of our greatest advocates and organizations have come as a result of people who didn't have it in their time of need. So Bonei Olam is amazing. So here's the basic issue of why it's so important to have this shomeret. And they are, I believe, all women They are all women. I don't think a man is able to be, for many specific reasons, why a man would not be able to do that, and I'm sure if you ever had a consultation, you probably would understand why. there is a prohibition, and I'm not going into all the halachic prohibitions tonight, but there's a prohibition of spilling seed. And that's a very strong prohibition within Jewish law. And because of that prohibition is so strong, it is very important that if there is a particular situation, that it be followed, that we know that this particular seed will not be spilled. And that is the basic halachic premise for it. And I think that it's important to also know that it's important, and we have the same thing, and it's a different conversation as far as organ donation. We're hoping at some point to do a similar type of information session about organ donation, because I get these questions a lot, and you know, why we can't just sign the back of our driver's license in the Jewish community. Different conversation for a different time. So therefore, it is important for us to have a third party selected. These people have undergone a training. They are not compensated based on the procedure's outcome. And like I said, Bonei Olam, and there's other organizations. I think even there's a local organization here in Montreal that also deals with it. IVF may also be permitted, though the physical components, which is the semen or the eggs used, are from non-Jewish sources. Now, halachically, if you're using the sperm of a non-Jewish man, obviously there's no way, even if the family is of Cohen or Levi descent, that child would not be a Cohen or a Levi because of that. So I'm just kind of opening up some of the other Jewish ramifications that come as a result of some of these things. I had a situation of a family he was a Cohen, and they used the sperm of a non-Jewish donor, and that became an issue because it's such a Cohen family, and they were very upset about it. They didn't know about it beforehand, and they were trying to figure out what do they do now. Well, there's nothing they can do, but thank God they have a beautiful, wonderful child, and so that's the result of that. But for some people, it's very important.
Rabbi, just curiosity.
Yeah.
If it's a Jewish donator of sperm, is it ranked Kohen? Are you still a non-Kohen?
You're talking about a whole other, like I said, I am generalizing here. I just wanted to kind of bring some of these issues up for you to have in your mind if this is something that you're looking towards. I definitely think every specific situation must be dealt with and with the care and concern and the privacy of that particular situation. There's also a whole thing about using the eggs of a non-Jewish woman, resulting in the halachically that opens up a lot of doors for what does that mean? Is the child Jewish? Does the child have to be converted? As well as if you had to use another woman, because it says in halacha mebeten imo, from the womb. What is that referring to? Just with that statement I just said, we just opened up a huge can of lots of stuff when it comes to Jewish law. I'm just trying to expose you to it, to know that this is an issue, though at the same time I'm saying it is an issue, within Jewish law there are so many amazing, because we do want this to happen. And we do want there to be the possibility, and we do very much encourage this. So though I'm kind of showing the issues, I'm saying at the same time there is a lot of dispensation that's made to make sure that children can be born, and that Jewish families that are not able to have children naturally should be able to have children. It is very important to always keep in mind that in order to facilitate these things, throughout the process there are things that could happen, and the reason why I really encourage that there be a rabbi who is trained and knows the laws to be able to follow that. And I'm assuming, Dr. Bazago, you've had situations where there was a rabbi that was following it the entire time, that there is, because there are so many. As you need a doctor, there are many other halachic issues that come up as you go along. And again, the goal of these halachic issues is not to say there's another step. Is it going to be that much more difficult for us? It costs us so much money. It's so difficult, and now I have to add the religious component? No, but it's just to make sure in the process, the Jewishness of the child, the other issues. I'll give you I mean, something fascinating in Jewish law, which obviously is also true in medical law when it comes to Jewish medical ethics, is if it's between the mother or the child's life, which one do we choose? We choose the mother's life. And there's a lot of reason for that. As far as abortion, many of you know, as far as the halachic ramifications of that, there's very, very rare, and I'm not going to say no, but very rare instances that abortion would be allowed according to Jewish law, and I bring that up as well. That said, I think that I just want to thank all of you tonight for exposing us to this and for taking the time and the care to be able to explain and talk about these things, because I do think that for some reason in our community, and I generalize as a whole, that there's been a taboo associated with it. And even though I knew when I was single that I was going for genetic testing, and I tell you it was not 2 little vials, they took 6 huge vials of blood from me. There was a lot of, so I figured 6 huge vials, there's definitely some kind of testing that Dor Yesharim was doing, that they needed so much blood. And we knew it, and then it was a thing. You know, there's no Jewish joke. What's the Orthodox pickup line? You want to go for a blood test? And it's a thing, right? Before you know, if you're going on a shidduch date, if you're getting match made, before you go out, you call up this number, and it's very, very confidential. Only the person who has that number, who is the individual, they will not talk to anybody. You can't be the matchmaker, you can't be the mom or the dad. Only that particular individual. Those 2 people have to call, and only those 2 people get the answer, and the answer is yes or no. That's it, which means they're both carriers or no, and that's it. You don't know, and there's a lot of reason for that. The main reason, it sounds crazy, why can't you get access to your own data? They don't want people in the Orthodox community to be stigmatized if they're carriers, because it only matters if you marry another carrier. So their opinion is, for the confidentiality, because there's so much community pressure about various things, what, you have to add something else? Oh, and you know, and your parents have this and that. So that way, this way, it's a non-issue if it's a non-issue. If it is an issue, it is an issue. And that's, I think, for the protection of the people, and I do believe that that's important. So, like I say, even though that there is such an openness to make sure this is all done, there is a stigma attached to it. There's a stigma to IVF. I have 2 nieces, 2 beautiful nieces, one that was born to my brother and sister-in-law, and the other one that was born to my sister and brother-in-law, that were both born through IVF. And I know that my sister-in-law had tried many, many times. And thank God they live in a city, and this is I don't think this exists here, but in the city they live in, there is a wealthy person who never had children, and they give money to people, Jewish people in the community, that want to have a child through IVF until they have their first child. They will give as much money necessary, as many times. So they were fortunate to live in a city where there was an organization that provided, I believe it was 7 times they tried. Yeah, until they had one beautiful daughter, who's now I think 4 years old. My niece is 4 years old. Huh?
You have, how many do you have? How many nieces and nephews do you have?
A bunch. Thank God we're a nice sized family.
So we don't remember she's 3.
Yeah, exactly. You'll have to forgive me, I'm sorry. So they had that, and so and my brother, when they first started, he called me and he said that, you know, is it okay, you know, because I somehow became the family rabbi, so, you know, is it okay, what do you think about it? And I told him exactly as I'm telling you, you know, as far as having a rabbi and having a shomeret, having someone watching it and having that follow through, but that it should not be stigmatized, and that we should definitely open the door and allow this to happen. And this is such an important part of our story, and I know it's the future of our people, and through technology we're able to do all this. So thank you all. And if there's any questions, I know that all of our panelists and people who presented here tonight, we're here and happy to take any questions. So I'll open up the floor. And obviously there's people who are watching online, if they can ask questions as well.
Really?
People watching online?
Yeah.
one question in reference to ethically. You said Gershwin does X amount of numbers, and you say that's the tree. To what degree do we say, or the private do the whole, what degree do we say it passes the line where, you know, I want my kids to have blue eyes and green, purple fingers and small nose, and where do we draw the line where the testing goes?
Well, you know, as far as right now, it depends on what you want. If you're willing to spend the money, and you're willing to send your DNA to a private lab, and you're willing to travel to China to get your baby modified, you can, you know, this is a wide open world and there's technology available for anything. Now the question is ethically, what do you choose to do?
So, first of all, the definition of ethical is, it's not even defined at this point, right? Ethical is like, your ethics might not be, your colleagues sitting next to you might have different ethics.
We have ethical committees.
Which makes what?
Ethical committees are comprised of a group of people, a psychologist, a lawyer, physician, a patient, people from the community that have nothing to do with the particular organization that get together and discuss these ethical issues. There is no genetic test for, you know, you can't have this model baby blue eyes, blonde hair, this doesn't exist. And that's not permitted, and I can't imagine that ever being permitted in Canada. In certain countries, perhaps, but definitely not here. What we're looking for are specific diseases, and out of the panels that you've seen, we're focusing on those diseases that have potential serious consequences on the child and their outcome, their health outcomes. Yeah.
So I would direct Eric's question to the rabbi, more than I would to an ethics committee.
And ethical, it also has to do with, she said there's an ethical committee which she is a part of.
Eric, I will tell you that there's actually an incredible responsa that was written about 3 or 4 years ago. And in there were many, many rabbis that contributed to it, and it's all about this on a Jewish law level. So there's definitely been a lot of conversation even outside of the medical community about these issues. There's a question that came online. Is there now actually testing for MLIV?
What's MLIV?
I don't know.
MLIV?
It says
MSUD.
It says MLIV.
I'm not exactly sure.
Can they say what it is?
Huh?
MLD, like metachromatic leukodystrophy?
I guess so.
So
That's all it says. I'm just reading the question from online.
for both of those things, if it's either MSUD, maple syrup urine disease, or MLD, metachromatic leukodystrophy, there is genetic testing available.
Okay.
I just want to say, I'm just going to give an example of a couple that came to see me that had decided to do this at-large genetic testing in a private lab, and it came to see me for a disease that really, mutation that caused a disease that really was not incompatible with life, definitely, and that was not, that maybe had a compatibility with normal quality of life, but that person can live and still have a good life. Like, you know, those are the questions that I'm getting now, or these scenarios that I'm facing, where couples come and they've had these tests done, and you know, what do we do with this test? Well, then I direct them to genetics because I don't know what to do or how to counsel that. It's really genetic counseling they need. But then I don't know, for you, like, how do you counsel people who come with a result where, okay, so they might have this mutation, but it's not the end of the world, you know?
Yeah, so first of all, like we said, it could be a long waiting list to see us. So if you've got a genetic testing that was not offered by us, you may be waiting for years to see us. That's the first thing.
Right.
Second thing is that this is why we like to do the pre-test counseling. So like I said, when you go to our website in order to take these Ashkenazi Jewish tests, we give you the information beforehand so you know exactly what you're getting into before you get into it. Once the cat's out of the bag, the cat's out of the bag, and you'll have to live with that over your head for a long time. So one of the, I give like a personal, thing, is that my mom recently found out that some of her family members had there was like cancer in one of her sides of the family that she didn't know, that she only recently found out about. They did direct-to-consumer testing, and they found a genetic change in one of these cancer genes. Now, they gave that to my mom's family, And my mom's family's freaked out. What do? So they call me, they send me the genetic change. And it's one of those that are right in the middle, that we don't do anything about, and that are difficult to understand. I would never have used this lab, because if you ask me in my lab to do that test, I would have sent you the results saying you're normal. But this lab didn't. They said, oh, we don't know, there's a Y in your Smith. So, that's why it's important to pick the right lab, that's why it's important to get the pre-test counseling, and that's why it's important to make sure that there's always either an MD or genetic counselor associated with the test that can explain what you're doing.
I'd like to add though, there's a distinction between, as Karen was saying, there's a distinction between some of these conditions that are life-threatening and ones that will have an impact on your life. And there are some who believe, knowing that you're both carriers of something that will have an impact on the life of your child, can actually lead to treatments or a treating of your child that is different than you would otherwise do. So for example, with maple syrup, right, it's a disease where you can't process proteins, am I right?
Exactly.
Right. So if you know you have the potential of having a child with maple syrup syndrome, then you're not going to put the child to your breast right away, right? To protect the child from those proteins. So there's different philosophies when it comes to testing, and this is what we were talking when I was saying the difference between, it's a more philosophical conversation, individual testing versus population screening. There's reasons that the ones that are fatal are being recommended population-wide, but people as individuals can make decisions on what they want to get tested for moving forward. So something could be it's not preventable, but you can treat a baby differently once it's out if you know it's a carrier or if it's affected by a certain disease. So these are the things, when we're talking about a panel of 3 versus a panel of 500, what you do with those results is different depending on which illness you're looking at.
So my daughter's pregnant.